then we'll have a video afterwards. Brilliant. Joe Butler has started to record. So we'll put this on YouTube and on Facebook afterwards. So with a little bit of a delay due to technical issues, it is a great pleasure to welcome to Live Irish Myths for the second time the wonderful Morrigan Daimler. So let's get straight to it. I won't be doing any more saying hello to people or whatever. We'll concentrate now on getting as much as we can in terms of this episode. Morrigan,
that was quite an exciting beginning.
Yeah, and more than exciting, entertaining, I think one could say. Morrigan needs no introduction. However, just in case you don't know who she is, Morrigan is a prolific author. I mean, exceptionally prolific in my opinion. I recently had reason to buy several of her books. So just to give you an idea of the sort of material that she has produced: The Gods and Goddesses of Ireland, a guide to Irish deities; The Morrigan, meeting the great queens. And these are all part of the Pagan Portal series. Manannán Mac Lir, meeting the Celtic god of wave and wonder. And these are all sort of similarly sized and beautifully, the covers are fabulous. The Dagda, meeting the good god of Ireland. But when I saw a while back that Morrigan was attempting a full translation into English of Cath Tuired, I said, this is something that I definitely have to get when it's available. So when it was completed, I reached out to Morrigan and said, listen, can I buy a copy of this? And she quickly dispatched one to me, and it arrived across the ocean in about a week. So Morrigan, without further ado, because I want to involve you, and this is about you, this isn't about me. Can you tell us a little bit about why Cath Tuired is so important among all of the early Irish myths, and tell us a little bit also about the manuscript from which it is derived?
Sure. I mean, obviously there's multiple important myths in the mythological cycle, which is the story of the Tuired. The Cath Tuired, to me, is really one of the most important, because it kind of gives us not only a lot of information about the Tuired sort of when their early time in Ireland, but it also gives us a lot of information about particular figures among that group that are really significant, and it's the most concentrated place that we have this material. You can find bits and pieces in other places, and there's a lot of stories where you might have one particular personage appearing. The story of how the Dagda got his magic staff, for example, it really kind of centers on the Dagda and then his son Kermit a little bit. Most of the stories that we have in the mythology are like that. They're like one main figure and maybe a few secondary ones. The Cath Tuired is everyone who matters kind of shows up there. And there's references to deities that are more obscure, beings that are more obscure that we don't know, we don't have a lot of information on. So there's just so much to it. You know, it's such a pivotal, important story. The manuscript is a nightmare.
Let me just, if you don't mind, read from the introduction. The Cath Tuired, often, this is the introduction to your book, sorry, often anglicised as the Second Battle of Tuired, is one of the most important tales in Irish mythology, telling the story of the battle between the Tuired and the Fomorians, and providing a great deal of insight into who the Tuired were. The story survived in a single 16th century manuscript called Harleian 5280, which has been translated into English several times over the last 130 years. But always with notable omissions. The first translation was done in 1891 by Whitley Stokes, but intentionally avoided passages the translator found to be difficult or obscene. A more thorough translation was carried out by Elizabeth Gray in 1983. However, this one omitted the more difficult poetic passages. As far as I am aware, there are no existing translations into English that include the entire original text, so I've undertaken to offer such here. What possessed you at all to attempt such a thing? I mean, let's call a spade here. You are not an academic scholar in Middle Irish, so you are encumbered with this great and onerous duty, but not having, you know, I'm sure you felt the burden of it. What possessed you to take it on in the first place?
Well, as you mentioned, I'm not, I don't have a degree. I didn't learn in university. I am self-taught. I taught myself so that I could read the myths in the original language, because the translations are often difficult in various ways. Even translations of more popular stories, like the Tonbokuli, can, depending on the translator, have issues. But this particular one, what it really came down to was, I had been aware that multiple passages are just not generally translated. And there's reasons for that, which get into the text itself. As you said, reading the introduction, there's only one copy of this particular story. There's variations of it that are included in other things, like the fate of the children of Tuired kind of includes this battle from a different perspective. But this particular story we only have in this one manuscript. And the manuscript itself is a nightmare. The language that's used in it is sort of intentionally archaic. The scribe who wrote it, a lot of times is basically inventing words, sort of that Lewis Carroll Jabberwocky approach to language.
Yeah.
And the poetic passages in particular can be very difficult to translate into modern Irish or English, try to figure out what they're supposed to be saying, which is why sane translators don't do this. They just, they hit these passages and skip ahead.
Perhaps understandably.
Yes. I will say that Isilda Carmody of Story Archaeology has done a few segments of things. She hasn't done all of the untranslated pieces.
I love her work too, yeah.
Yeah, she's amazing. So there are a few pieces. The Morrigan's Two Prophecies, I believe she's done. And I think Lugh's Battle Incitement as well. So
yeah, it begins really in the frame of Laura Gawala, doesn't it? It's basically the same introduction as the Book of Invasions in terms of where the Tuatha Dé Danann came from, you know, Murius and Gorius, etc., and the four
cities.
Yeah. Is there any indication that the how do I ask this? Is there any indication of a sort of a tie-in, as in, was the scribe who was writing this perhaps familiar with Laura Gawala, or do you think this was independent completely?
I definitely think he would have been familiar with the Laura Gawala Aaron. I think he also was probably drawing on various stories at the time. And, you know, scholars who have sort of gone through and tried to discuss the Cath Moitura as just a manuscript, a text, have pointed out parts that seem to be sort of an interweaving of what was probably originally two different stories, regional variations of stories. The Dagda's encounter with the Morrigan at Glen Etin, for example, followed by his encounter with the Fomorian princess. Those two sort of follow each other, and they're not identical, but they have very similar themes. Where the Dagda meets up with, in the first case, someone who's said to be his wife, the Morrigan, and they have a assignation, as the polite phrase would go, and then the female person in question promises battle support and victory. And then, you know, in the second case, it's the daughter of one of the Fomorian kings who he meets, and they have a much more entertaining time which is why Stokes does not translate that passage at all. He just completely exempted
That was
it.
just to do with the sensibilities of the Victorian era, I presume, in the late 19th century, when we didn't talk about sex and violence and brutality and such things.
Yep. He actually, in a footnote in his translation, where he kind of acknowledges that he has skipped it, because it's a significant passage, basically says that it was obscene and that he didn't feel that it was necessary for an audience to have that material. But we see that same idea of the Dagda with this second woman, the Fomorian princess, and then she promises eventually aid in battle. So some scholars have suggested that was two different versions of a story that had kind of been put together by this scribe.
Yeah. What do you think would be the situation? I probably know the answer already, but where would we be without Cath Tuired if that manuscript had been lost?
I honestly don't know, because the other pieces of it that we have in other places, for example, the fate of the children of Tuired, that story, because it's so much later, it was written down, I should say, at about the same time as the manuscript for the Cath Tuired that we have. But the manuscript for the Cath Tuired that we have, as far as most scholars' opinions go, dates back much further. It was probably a scribe that was copying a much older manuscript. And there's multiple things in the text that kind of point to that. John Carey has a very excellent article discussing this, all of this, relating specifically to this manuscript of the Cath Tuired.
John Carey, the medieval scholar who is almost
Yes.
as prolific as you in terms of his output.
He's an absolutely brilliant man. I admire his writing a great deal. But yeah, when you look at the fate of the children of Tuired, which was written about the same time, that story clearly has what would have been contemporary political influences going on for the 16th century in Ireland, whereas the Cath Tuired does not seem to. It seems to reflect older stories. And the other little bits that we have, like Lugh fighting Balor, which survives in folk tales, particularly in the western part of Ireland, they're little pieces. They're like snippets. The Cath Tuired, this particular manuscript, is really the only place where we have this fully fleshed out, such as it is. Old Irish mythology is always a little sparse compared to what we would expect in modern literature, but this fully fleshed out story, kind of start to finish, and there's so many things in it that are just fascinating and important to know. This is the story that tells us that Maige, the Dagda's daughter, Brigid would be the modern version of her name, that she was the one that invented keening, that she was the first person to keen in Ireland after her son is killed. And that's something, as far as I know, that we don't find mentioned elsewhere. When it's referenced, it's usually referenced from this. There's just so much wonderful material in it. I could continue to go on. I have a graph for the Cath Tuired.
I wanted to ask you a few specifics. There was one section in it that I found fascinating, and this was to do with the ring and Dalbaith and Bres. I call it like an Irish Lord of the Rings sort of scenario.
I can see that.
If that's short enough, that's early on, isn't it?
Yeah, it's towards the beginning.
I just want, perhaps we could read a bit of it. Also, we have to absolutely talk about the role of Lugh in the battle and in marshalling the troops to battle. Even though Nuada is the king, it's a very bizarre one. I know you and I have discussed that off list. Where is the bit where the ring? I want to perhaps
it starts.
Maybe you'll read it.
Bres's conception starts at 15.
15, yeah, and it was early on.
15. It's like page 6.
Do you want to read
That's
it?
my copy. You can read it.
Now then, this is how the conception of Bres came to pass. One of the women one day was looking at the sea and the land from a house of Moiskeni, that is Eru, daughter of Dalbaith. She saw the sea in perfect calm, the same as a smooth table. There afterwards she saw something. Appearing to her was a silver boat. Its size seemed large, but its form did not appear clearly to her, and the stream of waves carried it towards land. Then she saw in it was a man of excellent appearance, and you've, as you say, you've quite literally translated, and that really continues into modern English usage in Ireland. We have a peculiar way of saying things. Instead of saying, I have done the dishes, we say, I'm after doing the dishes, you know, I'm after falling on the stairs, you know. Then gold yellow hair he had to his shoulders, a cloak with ordered bands of gold thread in it. His shirt was embroidered with gold thread. A gold brooch was on his breast with the shine of a precious gem in it. 2 silver spears and 2 shafts of smooth crafted bronze. Tom King is in the forge there watching, forging away as we speak. 5 circles of gold around his neck, a gold hilted sword with silver inlayings and studs of gold. The man said to her, "Shall I have an hour of copulation with you?" "I have no tryst with you," said the woman. "Come to the trysting," he said. By the way, if you want Gray's version of this, I think we did that in episode 2 all the way back in March. They spread out together then. The woman wept afterwards when the man arose. "Why do you weep?" he said. "I have 2 reasons to lament," the woman said. "Parting with you, however, we have joined. The youth of the Tuired day have vainly entreated me, and my jealous love for you possessing me so quickly. Your distress will be removed about these 2 things," he said. He drew off a thumb ring of gold from his middle finger and put it in her hand, and told her not to part from it by sale or by gift, but to the one whose finger it would fit on. "There is another concern on me," she said, "that I don't know who has come to me." "There will be no ignorance of that," he said. "Elatha, son of Delbaith, has come to you, king of the Fomorians. You will have a son from our sexual relations, and no name will be on him but Yochi Bres, that is, Yochi the Shapely." And Morgan, if I can say, I love the copious footnotes in which you have at all times held your hands up where there are words that have perhaps perhaps where there is a little bit of doubt, or where there are multiple options. So your footnote says both the words Bres and Cruach can mean fair formed. Bres usually reads as great or mighty, and Cruach as fair, beautiful, or shapely. In this sense, what we have here is a play on words, with the child being named Yochi Bres, then referred to as Yochi Cruach, both of which can be translated as Yochi the Shapely, but with different connotations. Because every shapely thing seen in Ireland, including plain and fort, ale and candle, woman and horse, will be measured in relation to that boy. So it will be said, this is, or that is a Bres. And of course, we encounter the same thing in Tochmark Etain, where everything beautiful is compared to Etain. Then the man went back homewards, and the woman returned to her home, and the well-known conception was given to her. Afterwards, the son was born, and the name was given as Elatha had said, that is, Yochi Bres. 7 days into the woman's laying in after childbed, there were 2 weeks' growth on the boy, and he obtained this increase until the end of 7 years, when he had obtained the growth of 14 years. In other words, he was growing much, much quicker than a normal human being.
Twice as fast, yeah.
Yeah. The result of this contention there among the Tuired was that the sovereignty of Ireland went to the boy there, and he gave 7 hostages of the strong men of Ireland, that is his maternal kin, for guarantors that he would return the sovereignty if he behaved in an unkingly manner. His mother gave him land afterwards, and had a fort built on the land, that is Dún Bres, and it was the Dagda who built that fort. And so we come to another aspect of Cath Tuired that has lots of parallels in the modern world, I feel, without getting into politics too deeply. And that is the reign of Bres, which is a curious episode, but is one I think which demonstrates where the kingship or sovereignty goes bad, as it were. And in fact, it doesn't go bad. It really starts bad from the get-go, doesn't it?
Yeah, because and there's a lot of layers to this, so I'm trying to organize my thoughts a little bit. The fact that he was maternal kin to the Tuatha Dé Danann, and his paternal kin with the Fomorians was actually sort of politically significant. So, people hearing the story in the context of, not the modern era would have immediately been like, okay, so they're giving their kingship to someone who would owe more loyalty to his father's people, basically, because it was always sort of viewed that you would have the strongest connection to your father's family. So that right there in the story is sort of a forewarning that his kingship is not going to go well. And then, of course, it proceeds to not, because his fathers can pretty much immediately start taxing the Tuatha Dé Danann and asking them of these enormous tributes be sent. And because it's his paternal kin, he allows it to happen. So that is not a good beginning for him. And then, of course, he himself, it turns out, he's not a good king. He's very stingy and ungracious. And those were two big qualifications for kings, particularly the mythic material.
So physically, as is the tradition that I don't know where it emanates from originally, but certainly in medieval times, the king had to be without blemish to rule. Bres is clearly a very beautiful man, but it has this sort of conflicted nature, would we say, where, as you say, on the paternal side, he's descended from the Fomorians, who are repulsive to the Tuatha Dé Danann, and on his maternal side, he's descended from the Tuatha Dé Danann. So that is a curious mix. It's sort of like almost like a theme straight out of sci-fi, like Star Wars or something, isn't it?
It is. And then, of course, we have Lugh, who is the mirror of Bres in a lot of ways, because he has the reverse. His mother is Fomorian, and his father is Tuatha Dé Danann. So, that immediately would kind of set the listeners up to understand that he had the stronger connection to the Tuatha Dé Danann compared to Bres. He had that stronger loyalty to his father's people. Of course, he was also prophesied to kill his Fomorian grandfather, so that complicates his relationship with his mother's relations.
That's a very, very interesting insight. I actually hadn't copped onto that. And what you've just said is very important. Lugh's father was Cian of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Lugh's mother was Ethna, who was daughter of Balor. And because of the prophecy, which is in Cath Tuired, isn't it? Is that where the prophecy about...
it's mentioned, yeah.
Yeah, Balor's grandson would kill him, was the prophecy. So Balor had Ethna imprisoned in a tower on Tory Island. And through magical means, Lugh eventually got the girl, so to speak. So I never thought about that. So immediately we have this profound insight. I'm so glad that we've had that discussion. But we can't talk about Cath Tuired without talking about the peculiarities around Lugh and Nuada. And so perhaps if I just sort of give a very brief summary and then ask you for your thoughts, Morrigan, because I think this is, we've spoken about this off list, and it's something that I perhaps want to write about myself in the future. And that is that the coming of Lugh is a very important episode in the history of the Tuatha Dé Danann, in their whole story. And this is the arrival at Lugh at the Hill of Tara, when the Dé Dananns are celebrating under their king, Nuada. And he asks the gatekeeper, if he can be admitted. And the gatekeeper asks him, well, what talent do you have? And Lugh proceeds to rhyme off 12 or 14 different talents. He's a smith, he's a poet, he's an artificer, he's a warrior, he's a this, he's a that, he's the other. He's basically a jack of all trades. He's a polymath. He's a brilliant Renaissance man. But he's refused on every count because the gatekeeper says, we have one of those, we have one of those, we have a poet, we have a warrior, we have a this, that, and the other.
Yeah, we don't
and
need
eventually, Lugh says, well, do you have any one man? I think he says man rather than person. Do you have any one man who possesses all of these talents? And of course, the answer is no. Nuada invites him in. There's a few challenges that he has to undertake. He has to play ficule or chess against the king. He has to throw the giant menhir or the standing stone back into the enclosure, etc., etc. But then something really... Oh, the harp, of course, yeah. But then something peculiar happens, and that is Nuada, seeing that he's in the presence of someone who's clearly cut out for leadership and greatness, yields the throne for the period of 13 days. Do you have any insight for us, or do you have any thoughts about what that 13 days might symbolize?
I mean, on the surface, there has been some mention, different scholars who have sort of taken on that particular scene, that it could have had some ritual connotations or context. The Cath is not always the most literal or direct text. So my personal interpretation reading it is that it's less 13 days as in literally sunrise to sunset for 13 days, but that it probably represented a specific sort of longer period of time, whether that was 13 months, 13 moons, a year and a day. I mean, obviously in the story he remains king during the battle for, I think it works out to like 7 years, because the war preparations take years and years in the text, and no one blinks an eye at that. No one's like, well, by the time the battle actually happens, Nuada is king again. Because then, of course, that's the story that tells of him falling in battle, and then Lugh comes in and saves the day. But it seems to have been sort of a ritual acknowledgement. And I think it's significant that Lugh then took the kingship after Nuada falls. So, was it a ritual relating to sort of acknowledging him as the heir, the next king designate?
There's a concern, isn't there, with their arms, because Nuada is the silver-armed. Well, at a certain point, when his arm, was that the first battle of Moitura, when Sreng cut his arm off and it was replaced with a silver robotic, the first mention of a prosthetic in mythology, I believe.
Which is fascinating. Yeah.
And apparently the story of Luke Skywalker having his arm chopped off by Darth Vader in Star Wars is genuinely related, is derived from that myth.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Apparently so. Joseph Campbell, of course, and George Lucas were great friends. And I think a lot of different world myths informed various themes in the Star Wars movies. But what I found fascinating, Morgan, and we discussed this again, and just for the benefit of the readers and the listeners. So Lugh arrives at Tara and offers his gifts to the king. The king eventually brings him in and welcomes him, yields his seat for the period of 13 days. As you say, that's some sort of a higher ritual function. Lugh is then, is he not, absolutely critical to the organizing of everyone for the battle. And in fact, isn't Lugh the one who we really should credit as being the one who wins effectively the war? But sorry to spoil it if any people haven't read it. Isn't Lugh effectively the one then who is largely responsible for the victory of the Dadanans over the Fomorians, even though he's not king? Nuada shrinks into the background. And in fact, I think we had this discussion after Lugh's arrival at Tara. Nuada doesn't get mentioned until very nearly at the end when he falls in the battle. It's almost as if, even though he's still king, he has absolutely no role in the thing at all.
Yeah, he kind of, as soon as Lugh comes in and becomes that sort of pivotal person, I would agree, definitely Nuada sort of goes into the background until of course, and in the battle, the biggest mention is that he gets killed. So by Balor, who then, Lugh comes in and confronts. So it's definitely interesting. And it's interesting to note that the reason they were celebrating when Lugh had arrived, before Lugh had arrived, was because Nuada had lost his arm, as you mentioned, in the Cath Moytura, the first battle of Moytura, and it had been replaced with one of silver. And early in the Cath Moytura, after Bres has kind of been revealed as a terrible king, Nuada's arm is healed and replaced with one of flesh. The original arm is sort of implied in the text. And because he's then whole again, he can become king again, which gets very awkward when Lugh shows up, which I think is part of why he then sort of steps back and steps down, because he acknowledges that Lugh is the one who's going to win this fight, not him. I have a whole personal theory about the scene that happens with Cath and Maige, where, for those of you that aren't familiar with the story, Maige is the one who heals Nuada's arm, and
Maige is Cath's son, isn't that right?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I should have said that. Maige is Cath's son. They're both healers among the Tuired, and Cath pronounces the healing evil, and then ends up striking his son 4 times. Maige heals the first 3, and then the 4th one is fatal, which doesn't hurt him that much because then he shows up a little while after that. So he's only sort of temporarily dead. That happens a lot.
As you do when you're one of the ever-living ones,
Yeah.
You can't kill me. It's only a flesh wound.
Death is just an inconvenience. But you have to keep in mind the context that Cian, Lugh's father, is Cath's son. So Lugh is Cath's grandson. And I've always personally suspected that Cath knew that Lugh was the one who was meant to come in. And if Nuada hadn't been healed, Lugh would have come in and just assumed the kingship and driven Bres out, and it would have been a different story. But because Nuada is healed, now they kind of have a surplus of kings. So you have sort of the older king who has been healed and starts the rebellion, so to speak. Now I have Star Wars on the brain. And then when Lugh shows up, he ritually assumes the kingship for a period of time, and then is sort of that key figure pushing the action, as you said. And then once Nuada is killed in the second battle, then he becomes the king. So,
yeah. Do you think that perhaps at one time there were, like as with many stories, that there were different versions of Cath Moytura, and this is the only one that we have, and that perhaps there is a contrivance here to make disparate elements of the story fit together, and that in fact the coming of Lugh is perhaps derived from another source altogether, and it's all made to fit like a hodgepodge?
Sure. I would say in that sense it's a little bit like the Lugh Aaron, which most certainly is a sewing together of different regional stories, which is why there's a lot of contradictions in that particular text. But there's another example besides the one I mentioned with the Dagda and the 2 women. We have, right after Lugh arrives at Tara, this scene where they go through and sort of question, what do you bring to the battle? What will you contribute to the fight? And then that exact same scene repeats slightly later in the story with different people being questioned, but it's effectively the same kind of scene. And that's another indication to me that you're probably right, that it's variations of a story that have been kind of put together and worked into one cohesive tale. Because there's no need for them to go back and ask a second time. We already covered all this, but let's just double check.
Yeah. What were the unique challenges for you personally in translating? I mean, so just for a little bit of background for some of the viewers who don't know you, Morgan, did you ever speak Irish?
I do have some modern Irish. I admit it is not fluent, and my accent is atrocious. So
So
I
same
get
as
a little
me.
awkward
So yeah.
speaking it. Yeah. Um,
And at what point then does somebody who's not fluent in modern Irish decide that, sure, heck it, feck it, I'm going to try and study of my own volition and with my own resources. I'm going to study the earlier versions of Irish and start translating texts. When did that come about? What moment of lunacy,
was definitely
or
lunacy.
or illumination? It's
It could
often
be
said there's a
both.
thin line between those two things: the
Uh,
wisdom and
Madness.
yes.
Yeah.
Was there a particular moment when you recall saying, "Damn it, I wish I could do my own translations"?
Yes. So it was about 2014 when I started really getting into this. And I completely blame Whitley Stokes and spite, because I'm not a fan of Whitley Stokes. His translations are often they're very popular because they're in their public domain, but they
Yeah,
often do take liberties. And as we pointed out earlier, he was very free with just not including things that he felt were not appropriate for his audience, in the
yeah,
1890s. And what had happened, I think, was I had started with Stokes' translation of the Cath, as many people do, again, because it's public domain. And then I had gotten Gray's. And I got to the scene with the Dagda and the Morrigan at the river. And I have a partially photographic memory. So I'm pretty good at, if I've read something, I remember not photographically what it says, but close. And I got to that part in Gray, and I'm like, this is not what Stokes said.
mm,
And I went back and looked at Stokes, and he has a very different passage there at key points. And I was like, well, they both can't be right. Either one of them is leaving out information, or
because there's only one source manuscript, so they can't
yes,
be referring to different sources. Yeah,
yes. And that is hugely important, because it's different if there's multiple manuscripts and you can get different versions of things. But I'm like, there's something going on here. And then I got upset because I didn't know which one was better, which one's more accurate. And then I got really paranoid, as you do with translations, about what does it actually say. We're looking at someone putting it into English, but what does the story actually say? And so, out of pure spite for Whitley Stokes, I sort of set myself the task of learning Sean-Gaeilge, Swain-Gaeilge, Old Irish and Middle Irish, and it kind of went from there. And that's also why I tried to do these untranslated passages, because I've read the story many times, but I really wanted to know, even if it wasn't going to make clear sense in English because it's poetic, but what do those passages say? What's in there that we're missing?
yeah. So, and quite apart from the fact that Stokes takes liberties, and as you say, decides not to translate material that he deems to be inappropriate, is the fact that his English is 19th century Victorian English. It's very archaic. I know that
Yep.
I attempted in Live Irish Myths to read Tugal Brunja da Derga, the destruction of da Derga's hostel.
Mm-hmm.
And after a couple of, I think it was 4 episodes, and after a couple of episodes, I realized this is terrible, and I think we switched to, I'm not sure if it was Cross on Slover or someone else's translation, which was a bit,
A bit better.
it's so archaic in its language too,
Mm-hmm.
that does not help. We're lucky, I
Definitely.
suppose, from the point of view that we have at our disposal now, as let's call ourselves, enthusiasts or amateurs, non-academic scholars. We have at our disposal material that a generation or several generations ago was only available to an elite group of people. You had to be a part of an established university. You had to have wealth to access these things. So we're very grateful for that. And of course, we're very grateful for your efforts to make these translations popular.
I will say, for people who end up getting my translation, talking about just approaches and Stokes and all that, I try to stay very literal. So not everyone likes my style in how it reads, but I think it's important, if we're going to have it in English, that we try to have as much of the flow that it had in the Irish. So I don't try to really make it pretty in English. I give you as close to what the original Irish was as possible.
Yeah. And I think at the time
that.
These stories were written down in the Middle Ages, they were bardic, poetic renderings, weren't they? I mean, these were almost sung or told in a very lyrical way, and in a probably a rhyming meter. And so to render that in English is very, very difficult to do, because you lose a lot of the rhyme for a start. You see that, for instance, in the Dunshanicus, if you look at the Irish version versus the English. Yeah. And then, as you rightly point out, and I see in plenty of your footnotes, there appear to be sort of what we would call, are they called kennings? Poetic kennings, where, you know, a combination of words can refer, it's like a metaphor for something, but it's not actual a literal description of that, which makes it even more obscure. It may have been that the way the stories were told pre-writing, being written down in the vellum, in the scriptoria of the monasteries, that there was a certain inherent meaning to phrases that couldn't be rendered, first of all, in the written word, and then certainly couldn't be rendered later on in English. So that's part of the challenge in this whole epic adventure that you're on, isn't it?
Oh, definitely, definitely. There's and I could give you examples of things that you'll run across reading the older Irish material, that if you read it and you take it literally and don't realize it's a kenning or an idiom, it's an expression for something else, it is not going to make any sense. Fia Lucht is one. It means raven's garden, the garden of the raven, however you want to handle that preposition. Now I can't remember the English, that's fine. But it actually is a term that means like a battlefield.
So a raven's garden, of course.
Yep. But
because the ravens presumably pick on the flesh after the battle is done, and there's plenty to eat, and it's a very evocative image once you know what it's supposed to mean. But when you're just going along and you read Raven's Garden, you're like, what is that? Yeah. And so any more examples? I'm trying to think of one that doesn't involve blood or ravens. There's so many words from blood in Old Irish. Well, it is a battle tale, you know. It is. My mind has gone blank. I'll think of another as soon as we move on to something else. Don't worry, if you think of one, by all means. There are a lot of them. Yeah, exactly. Do you have favorite passages from Cath Maige Tuired and least favorite passages? There's so much of it that I would say probably falls into favorite, just because it really is such an evocative story. You kind of get pulled into it, what's going to happen. Even after you've read it, you go back. And least favorite, let me think. Probably the conception of Bres, which is part of why I didn't want to read it, because I can't read it with a straight face. It just, and in context, it's wonderful and very important to the mythology, but it reads for a modern contemporary reader kind of like a Tinder hookup. Like he just shows up and he's literally like, would you like to have some private time? And you know, she's like, no. And then, don't you want to get to know me first? She literally doesn't even know his name. And so I get to the part where she's like, and the other reason I'm sad is I don't even know who you are. And I can't with a straight face read that part. Just to be totally honest. I can understand. Yes. There are perhaps aspects that of it that remind one of sort of fairy tales, you know. I'm reading here because I'm sorry, I hate, on the one hand, I hate marking books, and on the other hand, I realize I have to mark books. I've highlighted. So is it the case, Morgan, it appears to be the case that Stokes and Gray do a great job, reasonably so, and I'm not in a position to criticize them because I'm not a scholar, but they do a great job on up to about the halfway point. And the sections that they find difficulty with, which are only partly translated or not at all, are in the latter part. Do you have any thought around that? It was just when I was marking it, I realized that the sections that they found difficulty with were actually in the second half of the manuscript. I'm just wondering, am I missing something? Is there a reason for that?
I don't know if it's just how the text originally was, but definitely by the time you get to the second half is where we really start to get into the poetic sections. You'll notice in the first half, there's not a lot of dialogue. There is some, you know, notably when Angus is giving his advice to the Dagda at the beginning, that's a longer passage. But generally, once we hit that second half, we start to see a lot of these sort of epic speeches happening. And the epic speeches are where we get these poetic. They wouldn't really have been speeches as we understand them. They would have been a specific type of incitement.
Or rhetoric.
Grassac is one. I'm not going to remember the name for the other. One of them is basically you would say something that was very negative towards your enemy. So a lot of Lugh talking to Balor's poet, Lugh, or to Balor himself in that scene is that sort of incitement. Basically, you're telling them that they're going to lose and you're going to win, and why? Because they're terrible. And then the other type of incitement, which is the kind we see the Morrigan using on Lugh, and then Lugh using later on the Tuired army, is the positive incitement where you're encouraging your side, get up and fight and win. But they're poems more than anything else. They would have had a flow and a meter and a rhythm to them. It wouldn't have just been the way we picture someone now kind of inspiring an army by getting up and giving a speech. Like it would have been like reciting a poem that would have inspired your army. And once you hit those parts, it gets tricky to translate because a lot of the older Irish poetry words have multiple meanings, and trying to pick which meaning to go with when more than one really applies. And that's, you'll notice there's a lot more footnotes in the second half than the first half.
That's another comment. And again, I think that's one of the wonderful, honest attributes of your work. I tend to be the same. I mean, I'm the first one to hold my hands in the air and say, look, you know, I could be mistaken, etc., etc. But what I noticed was that the first time in your footnotes that you say this passage in its entirety is usually not translated, Gray stops after battle will be waged, Stokes omits this entire section, was at section numbered 83. So the paragraphs in the original manuscript are numbered. So if you think about it, 83 and the last in the book is 167. So that's actually pretty much halfway, exactly halfway into the book. The scholarly translators start to hit difficulties.
Yes. Yeah. And then once they hit that point, there's quite a lot that, and the thing is, if you read Gray, or particularly read Stokes, but even Gray, you don't even always notice, because she would just do like 3 dots at the end of the sentence.
The ellipsis. In other words, something's missing here. Yeah.
Yep. And then go to the next section. And it's easy to not realize sometimes how significant these missing passages are. Particularly when you get to the very end, the confrontation between Lugh and Balor. I think the majority of that is just not translated.
Yeah. And you wouldn't necessarily get the impression. You have to study it. Like you're right. The wonderful thing about Gray's and many of the scholarly translations of the Irish. So here's an example. So I'm just going to show people here. This is Elizabeth Gray's translation of Tuired by the Irish Texts, published by the Irish Text Society. So on this, so on every left-hand page, you have the Irish text. And on the right-hand page, you have the English translation. Now, here we have sections this is section 136. And as you can see, there are a number of paragraphs on this page which do not have a translation on this page. As Morgan rightly says, there are ellipses here which indicate that there's something missing. And so one can clearly see that there's a lot of Irish text on the left, but it trails off with, then Lugh said these words in answer to him, a man cast who does not fear you, ... and it ends there.
Yep.
But I think it's fair to say, Morgan, that you're not trying to demean or diminish the works of Stokes or Gray in any way.
Well, Stokes maybe a little bit, but
well,
not Gray. I love Gray.
Yeah, let me rephrase. In order to have the fullest understanding possible, it's probably advisable to have all three. I don't have Stokes. I have Gray, and I now have Daimler. And I'm very glad to have both of them. But in order to get to grips with the story in the fullest way possible, it's probably best to have three. Is that right?
Yeah, you get.
But I think I have the best two of the three. Am I right?
I dislike Stokes, so I'm not going to argue with you. The biggest thing to keep in mind with Stokes really is just that, unlike Gray, he doesn't always indicate when he's not including things. Like that example where he put the footnote in when he cut out the entire passage with the Dagda and the Fomorian princess. He doesn't say anything. There's nothing in the text. If you don't go to the footnote, you'll have no idea. It just ends and then goes to the next section. He also is very prone in the work that he does translate of either adding material or excluding material. So he refers to the Morrigan as a lamia, for example, in one passage, which is not in the original text at all, but the way he puts it in, it looks like it was. And he was just translating what the original scribe had written. You know, the woman here is the Morrigan, a lamia. But that was his opinion. That was his little insertion.
Yes.
Gray, however, Gray is excellent. And I would get the Irish text version by Gray just because after the actual translation she does, the notes that she has are amazing.
Yeah. Yes.
And then
just
she gets
for the notes alone.
Yes.
In fact, yes.
Yes. In the notes, she gets into talking about each individual personage. So there's an entire section about Lugh, where she talks about him not just in the Kamaitura, but sort of more broadly. And there's so much wonderful information in there. So yeah, definitely Gray's translation is invaluable.
Tell me then about the Bob or the Morrigans. What would we call them? Do we call them chants, poems, songs? The Song of the Morrigan at the end of the tale, because they're sort of contradictory, aren't they? In
It's
one,
sort of prophecy poems, yeah.
Yeah. In one, she's prophesizing peace and plenty. Mm-hmm. And in the other, she appears to be looking forward to a time of great evil and, bad deeds, etc. Well, first of all, if you look at Gray's version, she only translates the first 8 lines of the first one, and the second one again, I think is it incomplete?
Yeah, it's I'm trying to. I also have my copy here. I'm trying to remember where Gray stops on the second one.
Yeah,
I think she does the first one. Works on like first 4 or 5 lines of the second one, and then doesn't do the rest of it.
What do you think personally in terms of the contradictory nature of those two prophecy poems? Do you think that they're what do you get in terms of your own personal sense of it? So this is a subjective question.
I mean,
Do
I've
you think,
seen it. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, do you think that they're both original to the text, or do you think that there was some meddling about with the text by the scribes?
See, you're thinking the same thing I'm thinking. There has certainly been suggested, and I could see the logic, that the second poem in particular, because it has a very sort of eschatological tone to it, was added. I could also see it being added because a lot of the things that it's referencing in context are references to what we would call Vikings or the Norse, which was something that obviously was a significant issue in Ireland at certain times, but probably not when this story was originally recorded. Depending on, who you agree with on their opinion of the dating of this, but it would certainly fit as something that was added later by people who were living through very difficult times with foreign invaders, depending on how you look at the Vikings.
Well, of course, the monasteries were the first target of the Vikings, weren't they? And they suffered horrendously at the hands of the Vikings. They were easy targets because they were undefended.
Yep. And they had all that wealth nicely collected. So,
by the way, that included the manuscripts, the books. The bound books were seen as great treasures, and were often carted off by the Vikings after they had run through some poor innocent friars or brothers with swords, etc. Well, perhaps Morgan, I'm going to put you on the spot. Would you maybe read the first one, "Peace to the Sky"? I love that opening line, "Peace to the sky," or "Peace mounts up to the heavens."
This is actually one of my...
I once thought I'd write a book with that title. I don't know what the book would be about. Undoubtedly would borrow from Danan themes, but I just think it's the most wonderful introduction to a poem ever. Peace to the sky, or peace mounts up to the sky. So peace is so bountiful now that it fills the earth right up to the sky. Sorry, I cut across you there.
No, that's okay. If you start writing it, I'm sure the inspiration will come. This is actually one of my favorite pieces. I recited it in the original Irish when I was at Tara because I just couldn't resist, because I love it. I love it in the original Irish too. It has such a beautiful flow to it. And this is another one, like you said, Gray only translates the first few lines, basically. So, "What news with you?" everyone asked her then. "Peace to sky, sky to earth, earth below sky, strength in each one, a cup overfull, filled with honey, sufficiency of renown, summer and winter, spears supported by warriors, warriors supported by forts, forts fiercely strong. Banished are sad outcries, land of sheep, healthy under antler points, destructive battle cries held back, crops on trees, a branch resting with produce, sufficiency of sons, a son under patronage, on the neck of a bull of magical poetry, knots in trees, trees for fire, fire when wished for earth, getting a boast, proclaiming of borders declaring prosperity, green growth after spring, autumn increase of horses, a troop for the land that goes in strength and abundance, be it a strong, beautiful wood, long-lasting, a great boundary. Have you a story, peace to sky, be it so lasting to the 9th generation." And
isn't that wonderful?
It is. It's a beautiful poem. And you can see it follows a pattern we find in a lot of older Irish poems where whatever ends one line then starts the next.
Yes. And isn't there a hint here of the sort of invocational poetry that we see later in Lower Gowalla with Amergin?
Yes.
Amergin's own sort of poetic incantations are full of the idea of abundance. It's as if he's proclaiming an abundance precisely at the moment that he has calmed the storm and the Milesians are about to set foot on the Boyne estuary to proclaim Ireland from the Didannans. I sort of really feels that there's a great similarity here between the two.
Yeah, no, it's it definitely fits that pattern of how you would sort of invoke prosperity and abundance and basically blessing for the land. And it just
in terms of, give us your opinion of what was the most difficult. Is there a stanza or a paragraph that you really found so difficult that you almost did what the previous scholars did and just ran the ellipsis through it?
I definitely understood when I was looking at the untranslated bits why translators with common sense don't do these passages, just because you end up sitting there trying to, with one particular word, trying to decide what it was supposed to mean out of usually 2 or 3 possibilities, none of which are exactly right, because of that intentionally archaic weirdness with the words that the scribe did. Probably, I think probably the one that I disliked the most was when Lugh and Bala are talking, and then Balor's poet Lugh comes in, and there are a couple points, and you'll see it in my translation where I have in brackets like unclear, because it just, I have no idea. I could not figure out what the word was. There were a couple points in there, particularly with Lugh, with his dialogue, where it's just very frustrating. And then you take, 15, 20 minutes with a single word, just trying to figure out what direction to go in. Okay, I mean, I can see in the chat, the nice advantage to Zoom as opposed to Facebook, that someone was asking if I could read the poem in the original Irish.
Oh, lovely.
I mean, I won't do the whole thing because it is long to get through, but I could do some of it.
Please, yes, we'd love that.
I will say before I start this that Old and Middle Irish are pronounced slightly differently from Modern Irish. So if you speak Modern Irish, you might not necessarily understand all of this, but you probably get some of it. It's not completely different. I like to say it's the difference between like Old English and Modern English. It's not quite the same, but similar. So, Shith ko nev ko dawn fo nev, nerticha an for lan do mil, myth ko seth, sa in noa, ge for skiath for durth, dunath langarth, longat trumfoeth, fad dui, Ross for Benna. And that's down through the land under antler points. So that's part of it. But yeah, I love it. I love the older Irish. I had the whole thing memorized at one point.
Impressive.
Yeah, I could probably still do it from memory if I wasn't facing an audience.
Yeah, there's that little bit of pressure. Well, you can imagine how I felt earlier on when I faffed about for 25 minutes trying to get you onto the live stream. Yes, it was like dig a hole and bury me here right now.
It
But
all worked out. If it makes you feel better, I was on the other side of my screen talking to myself. It's like, I don't know why this won't work.
Yeah, I still can't answer that. But anyway, we got there in the end. Thank you with gracious thanks to Joe for stepping in. Folks, this is, it's very easy to follow too. The text is nice and big. The footnotes are copious, and I love that. If anybody attempts a work like this, it's very important. Footnotes and references, and basically to explain yourself, so that your heart is on your sleeve, and at all times, people know that you're not, trying to pull the wool over their eyes or anything like that, which you're certainly not trying to do.
Well, there are certain points where there was definitely wordplay that was intended in the original, and there's just no way in English to preserve that. When they're talking about Ogma's sword that he got from Tethra, the Forian king Tethra, there's a whole poem that's recited about the sword, which is a beautiful poem. But Tethra's name itself is a bit of wordplay. It means the sea or the ocean. So the poem has all these references to waves and the sea, but some of the words also can mean other things. Particularly, I think I mentioned in one of the footnotes, there's a word that gets translated, I do it as sea, but it's the sea silently stealing. The word actually in the text was Tethra, his name, but not capitalized. So it was obviously meant to be a play on his name, the name of the original owner of the sword, which also means sea or ocean. And there's another part where the word nin is used, which means wave or cloud. And both could have fit. And, hearing it in the original language, you would have gotten sort of both images. You know how waves can get that effect when they're breaking and you get the foam coming up and almost looks like a cloud. And there's no way in English to convey that. So
that is the onerous duty of the poet. The poet's role, as far as I'm concerned, in ancient times and in modern, is to describe to us in ways that cannot be done with ordinary language, is to describe those transcendent moments and those mysterious and mystical things that we encounter in nature and in life.
And even poetry in English, if it's done well, sometimes you can't really pin down a literal meaning. It's just imagery. It's evocative, but we see the same thing in some of these poems, which I think is why they're usually not translated, because translating, you have to make choices for what direction to go in English, and no matter what you do, you're losing some of the beauty of it in the original.
Yeah. But once again, I would say that we are in Ireland, more so than in much more so than in Britain, and much more so than in many places. We have retained such an enormous wealth of mythological material, largely because of the hard work of religious people who, in the Middle Ages, probably found the task overbearing, because not only was it taxing in its physical endurance and mental endurance required, but also because of the material, which was overtly pagan and pre-Christian in nature. It must have been a seriously overwhelming and taxing thing to undertake. But we're very, very.
I was going to say, some of my favorite things in some of the older texts is you will get these passages that are very pagan, and then you'll have a scribal insertion, and it'll usually show up. I don't know if it was originally marginalia, but now they'll put it like in parentheses in the digital text, and it will literally be the scribe being, but of course now we know that the real truth is Jesus Christ.
Yes. Just in case anybody was under any doubt. Yeah.
Covering their bases. Like I'm recording this very pagan story, but just to be clear. So that always entertains me when I run across those.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. Morgan, it has been the most wonderful conversation. I know that we could talk for hours. I think we're about half an hour. It's 1 hour and 47 minutes now. So we've gone over, we're about an hour and 15 minutes. But so
I've lost all sense of time. So,
well, of course, and that's what happens. On behalf of myself, of course, but certainly on behalf of the Mythical Ireland viewers here on Zoom and on YouTube, can I extend gratitude to you, not only for participating, but in fact for this work that you have undertaken, which will add significantly, I think, to our libraries of knowledge and lore. And to also extend a thank you to Joe Butler. Joe, thank you for stepping into the breach when all seemed lost, when it seemed we might have to put off the episode for a day or two, and for making it happen. If there are any questions for Morgan, I'll just step out of the way, and maybe Morgan, you might take 2 or 3 questions just before we close out for the night. I'm seeing comments. I'm only seeing them one at a time, and I'll watch YouTube for any questions as well.
Sure.
Morgan, there was one from Graham Conley. Did you see that?
About how I had learned.
Yes. Yes.
Sure. Well, I am, of course, self-taught. So most of what I did, see, they're all sitting behind me. You can go online now, what Anthony was saying earlier, but you don't have to be involved in universities. There's quite a lot of material that was originally textbooks or is still used as textbooks in university courses for Old Irish. And you can get those. Some of them are a lot older at this point. If I will spare you my wall of dictionary that's behind me. I have a sad dictionary collecting compulsion. But you can pretty easily find most of these online, and they're just the same books that you would use generally in university. The biggest difference, of course, not going to university is you don't have a teacher. So you can't go to someone and ask questions if you're having a difficult time. There are also some sources online. University of Texas has part of their older Irish language program available. So that's an option, but being stubborn helps, and just scour every possible available source. And, you can always keep your eye out for online courses. At this point, with more things being moved online, you might be able to find one.
Yeah. Morgan, Barbara Murphy on YouTube is asking, how long did it take you to do the translation?
Altogether, I want to say about 6 months, but I wasn't working on it consistently.
Yeah.
For everyone who doesn't know this, I have 3 children, and thanks to COVID, I have 3 children who are always home and who are schooling from home. So that has taken up a lot of energy this year. And I do write, professionally, as it were. So I was dedicating about 1 day a week to working on the translation over the course of those 6 months. And I would just do a section at a time and work through it. I think if I sat down and just tried to do it straight through with nothing else, it'd probably be maybe 2 or 3 weeks worth of work straight through. I'm guessing.
Brilliant. A lot of people are just saying thanks, a huge amount of thanks. I imagine that there is a few orders as well. People are saying they've ordered the book. A couple of people looking for the link. So I've just shared the link again as to where to buy. And I will do so again in a new post on the Facebook page, given that we've gone off Facebook. I will do so when we're finished.
Okay.
I don't think, are there any more questions? I don't think so. Just people saying thanks.
We've got one. Aaron was asking, is there anywhere we can find the Peace of the Skies prophecy in the original Irish online? I have it up on my blog, Living Liminally. If you search Living Liminally Prophecy, it should come up. Other than that, I believe you would have to, it's in Gray's work, which is not online. Isolde Carmody may have it. I believe she's also done the first prophecy, so she would have the original Irish with that as well.
I have that link here, which I will share on YouTube because I'm on the phone. I can't share it on the phone, but again, I'll share that on the Facebook page. And that's your blog site, which is, we were talking about Laura
It's a little bit of
Vaughan
everything.
the other day, Morgan. We were talking about in our last episode about hunting the wren and the mummers on St. Stephen's Day, because one of the traditions, which apparently was confused between Halloween and St. Stephen's Day, was the Laura Vaughan, the white mare, which was paraded about from place to place, which is fascinating. So I've shared that as a link on YouTube, and I will do on the Facebook page.
Yep. Yeah, Laura Vaughan is years and years ago, back when it was fashionable for the young people to have alternative names on the social media. I'm making myself sound so old when I say this. Because there are so many Morgans out there. I used to go by Morgan Laura Vaughan. If you happen to be on LiveJournal, that was how you would find me. I really sound old.
Yeah, don't mention Bebo.
Yeah.
Oh, kids today, they just don't know.
They don't know the struggle.
No, they don't. Or don't talk about pre-internet days. But with exceptional grateful thanks to Morgan for what has been a wonderful evening, and
it's been really
we
fun.
are indebted greatly to Joe Butler, who not only has provided us with the Zoom facility to continue the episode, but is also recording it. And hopefully I'll talk to Joe off list or off air, as it were, about how we get that onto YouTube and Facebook later on. But anyway, in the meantime, I see Tom King there in his forge. This is the wonderful thing about Zoom, is you can see people. Tom has been forging away all evening, which he does every time Live Myths is on. He's making something. By the way, this is one of Tom's wonderful creations, nice. the swan spiral pendant. So just saying hello to Tom. So that's all I have for you. We'll pick up next week on Live Irish Myths. I think the subject is, I haven't settled completely, but I think the subject is likely to be numbers in Irish mythology on the next episode. But don't forget between now and then. Yeah, don't forget between now and then we'll also have an episode of Book Talk, because it's not like there aren't enough books behind us to talk about. Lots of thanks to Morgan. Thank you for everybody for your patience and your perseverance during the technical difficulties. And again, thanks to Joe for stepping into the breach and making it all happen. Morgan, it's been a pleasure, and I hope that it's not going to be too long before we have you on as a guest again.
Thank you for having me. It was great crack. So I enjoyed it, even the shenanigans beforehand.
We didn't mention the F word. I can't believe it. We'll get another chance at that.
Anyone that wants to stay, I'll open up the video so we can see each other's faces.
Oh, great.
Open up the videos. If you don't know how, I can do it for you. And thanks to Morgan.
Yes, thank you for facilitating. Hi, everyone. I'm going to have to leave because I have to go find out why my children are still being so quiet. That's suspicious. So.
Completely understandable.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Morgan. Cheerio.
So anyone that wants to open up, you can go to the top right. And you can get the video on. You got your videos on. Yay, I can see you.
Hi, Joe.
Hi,
all right, I stopped my video and it won't let me turn it on.
Oh, poop. But I can see Desiree. Oh my gosh.
I'm going to scroll through and see who I can see. Aaron and Tom. Oh, I can see Natalia and Melanie. There's Melanie Lynn. Hello, Melanie. Neil Hughes has got the Fiam Jarek. Hello, Neil. And Desiree is there. Hello. Brilliant.
Joe, you
Paula, is that Paula Snow Queen? It says Paula's iPhone. I presume that's Paula Snow Queen
That's me.
Marion is there. Kristen Murray-Andre, hello. Oh, I'm seeing faces I've never seen, so this is great. Shannon Donahue is there. Veronica, hello, Veronica. Sorry, I suddenly just started behaving like a schoolboy in the schoolyard. Brilliant stuff. Anyway, thanks, Joe. You really, really saved the day there, and we're indebted to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe.
You're all
Thank you,
welcome.
Joe.
I'm so glad to see
Brilliant
you
job.
all. I'm so glad I could help.
The YouTubers are really missing out tonight. I feel sorry for them, but at least
Thank
they
you,
were able
Joe.
to hear the whole thing, which is a
Thank you
start.
so much.
And I will provide the link for the Zoom. When we get the video sorted, Joe, I'll talk to you about that afterwards. But when we get that, we'll try to upload it to YouTube and perhaps onto Facebook as well. So in the
Thank you.
meantime, I'm going to say goodnight. And thanks all for joining. That was brilliant in the end. I mean, the first 25 minutes were very funny. But Tom is out in the cold, but you're not so cold there with the fire blazing away.
Very good. Thank you very much, Anthony.
No problem.
All the blessings from the forge to all.
Good night to everyone.
Everybody.
Hello, lads.
Thank you,
Good
Joe.
night,
Yeah,
everyone.
Happy New Year. We
Take care.
probably won't have another episode until
Happy-
what day is it? Oh no, we might have another episode in 2020. Might have book talk before the year's
Thanks,
out.
everyone.
Yeah.
Take care. God bless. Thank you, Joe. Good night, all. Bye-bye.
Good night,
Good
lads.
night. Cheerio.
Thank you, Joe.
So great to see everybody.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
We got to do this again. Joe, tell him that we got to do this again.
I can't figure out how to turn my video on.
Who is this?
Yvette.
Yvette. Oh, Yvette.
I'm Harry
I can't
Mayer.
turn mine on either.
Can you see down in the bottom bar? There's a thing that says video and audio, little camera. If you click it, it'll turn your video on.
I may be able to do it for them.
There you go, Joe. Paula, I see you're still there.
I've asked Paula to unmute.
Well, I can hear you guys.
There you are. There you are.
Yay!
Yay. And Barb is here.
Barb, do you want to unmute?
Rowan.
Yeah, but I can't get my video on.
Top the screen. Top the screen.
No, it says the host has stopped it, so it won't. I can't start it.
You top the
Yeah.
screen. The bar
I'm
comes
the-
up at the bottom.
I'm the same host. It's okay.
Harry Mayer, who are you?
Yvette.
Oh, is that you, Yvette? Okay.
Yvette Tillema.
There's
What are you
Rowan.
reading tonight, please?
Awesome.
Rowan?
Hey,
There's Rowan. Hi, Rowan.
Hi, Rowan.
Hi. And Jen.
Yeah, me too. I hiked a mountain. I'm a wreck.
all my books behind me.
And who's TML? Are you? Oh, their audio is still off. Oh, this is so fun. We should totally do this sometime just for fun.
I agree. I can work this out.
Oh, happy dance.
No, thank you.
Oh,
Oh, it worked.
yay! And Jen.
Yep, this is my first time. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Yay!
Yay.
Mhm.
Who is
Yay!
that little one?
She just said, I'm Maeve.
Her name is Maeve.
Oh,
Wonderful.
May.
Oh, so cute.
Thank you so much.
We'll look for the post on Facebook then. Is that what you're gonna do, Joe? You're gonna record it and then post it on Facebook?
Well, let me stop recording.